There's a moment in every wedding ceremony when the bride and groom look into each other's eyes and make promises about forever. But what if I told you that the most powerful wedding vows ever spoken were made by beings who knew, with absolute certainty, that forever would end in exactly 0 winters? What if the most profound acts of love in human history were performed by gods who hated each other's guts but married anyway because the alternative was universal annihilation tonight? You're going to witness something that will fundamentally change how you understand love, marriage, and sacrifice. You're about to discover that every wedding you've ever attended, every romance you've ever cherished, every promise of eternal devotion you've ever heard, is based on a template created by divine beings who knew their marriages were suicide pacts designed to buy time before the end of everything. The Norse gods didn't marry for happiness. They married to prevent Ragnarok from arriving early. Every divine wedding was a desperate attempt to maintain cosmic balance. Every kiss was a negotiation between forces that wanted to destroy each other. Every promise was a contract written in the knowledge that all contracts end in death and fire. But here's what will haunt your dreams. They called it the most beautiful thing in existence. Because when survival itself requires you to bind yourself to your opposite, when love becomes indistinguishable from sacrifice, when two beings who should be enemies choose to create something greater than their individual destruction, you're witnessing the birth of every story about love that has ever mattered. You're about to enter a world where wedding gifts were weapons of war, where bridal veils were woven from fate itself, where the phrase "till death do us part" meant something terrifyingly literal because death was coming for everyone, gods and mortals alike, in a countdown that began the moment each couple said, "I do." These are not love stories, these are survival stories, and by the time this night is over, you'll understand why the Vikings believed that the most courageous thing any being could do was promise to love someone they were destined to lose. You're sitting in what remains of the world. Outside the Great Hall, winter has lasted 3 years without interruption, and you can hear the wolves that follow Fenrir growing bolder each night, their howls echoing from forests that no longer remember the sound of human laughter. The fire in the centre of the room burns higher than it should, as if it knows it needs to fight against more than cold tonight, and the shadows it casts on the wooden pillars seem to twist and writhe with meanings that existed long before humans learned to carve stories into wood. But you're not here to think about the end of the world. You're here because the Skald has promised to tell you something that will make the end of the world make sense, something about why the gods themselves chose to create the very bonds that would ensure their own destruction. Something about why beings with the power to reshape reality decided that love was worth dying for. The Skald rises from his place near the fire, and you notice that his eyes reflect light in a way that human eyes shouldn't, as if he has looked too long into places where time moves differently, and cause follows effect in patterns too complex for mortal comprehension. When he speaks, his voice carries harmonics that seem to come from somewhere deeper than his throat, resonating with frequencies that make your bones remember things your mind has never learned. The first thing you must understand, he says, is that before there were gods, there was only the potential for gods. Before there was love, there was only the mathematics of survival. And before there were weddings, there was only the recognition that some forces are too dangerous to exist alone and too necessary to destroy. The gods married not because they chose to love, but because they chose to continue existing. And in a cosmos where chaos is the natural state, existence itself is an act of rebellion that requires constant maintenance. But calling it maintenance misses the terrifying beauty of what actually happens when immortal beings bind themselves to other immortal beings, while knowing that immortality is itself a lie. The Norse gods live forever, but they live forever toward an ending they can see approaching with mathematical certainty. Every wedding they celebrate brings them one step closer to the moment when all weddings end, when all promises are broken, when all love dissolves in the fire that consumes the world tree itself. This is the context in which you must understand everything that follows. The gods are not modelling human behaviour. They are teaching humans how to love in the face of guaranteed loss. Every divine marriage is a lesson in how to create meaning within meaninglessness, how to build something beautiful while knowing that beauty cannot last, how to choose connection over isolation, even when connection guarantees pain. The scene around you begins to shift, or perhaps your perception of it deepens, and you realise you're no longer simply sitting in a human hall listening to human stories. You're witnessing the actual events themselves, standing in spaces that exist outside normal time, observing the cosmic negotiations that shape the structure of reality itself. The first marriage you witness is not a ceremony, but a recognition. Not a celebration, but a moment when two fundamental forces of existence acknowledge that they cannot fulfill their purposes alone. Odin stands before you, but not as the one-eyed wanderer of later tales. This is Odin as he was before sacrifice taught him the price of wisdom, before the ravens and the wolves, before the knowledge of ending shadowed every decision. He is power without guidance, authority without understanding, the potential for leadership that could easily become tyranny if left unchecked by something greater than itself. Frigg appears not as a goddess, but as a principle given form, the embodiment of wisdom that sees all outcomes and speaks of none. Her presence doesn't announce itself with trumpets or miracles, but with the subtle shift that occurs when chaos recognizes its own boundaries. She's not beautiful in any way that human senses can appreciate, because her beauty operates on scales that transcend appearance, existing in the mathematical elegance of systems that function perfectly, because they know their own limitations. Their wedding is not an event, but a process. Not a moment, but a transformation that occurs across centuries and is experienced by you in the space between heartbeats. You watch as Odin recognizes in Frigg not a companion but a completion. Not someone to possess, but someone necessary for his own proper functioning. The authority he offers to share with her, symbolized by the right to sit upon Lidskjalf and see all things, is not a gift, but an acknowledgement that power without wisdom is indistinguishable from chaos. Frigg's acceptance of this sharing is equally profound, because she understands that taking on this role means accepting responsibility for outcomes she can foresee, but cannot prevent. When she agrees to see all things and speak of none, she is choosing to bear the weight of knowledge that would crush any being less perfectly adapted to the burden. Her silence about the future is not secretiveness, but mercy. A recognition that beings who must act cannot also carry the full weight of consequence. But the true tragedy and beauty of their union only becomes visible when you witness it in the context of Baldur's death. The event that reveals the fundamental nature of divine love. Frigg knows that her son will die. She has always known, from the moment of his birth, that Baldur represents beauty and innocence that cannot survive in a cosmos moving inexorably toward violence and ending. Yet she loves him with the fierce protectiveness that only comes from complete knowledge of what will be lost. Her attempt to save him, the great quest to make all things swear not to harm him, is not the desperate action of a mother in denial, but the conscious choice of a goddess who understands that love means acting against knowledge, that the only appropriate response to guaranteed loss is the decision to fight against it anyway. She fails not because she lacks power or wisdom, but because the cosmos itself requires Baldur's death as part of the pattern that will eventually lead to renewal. Odin's response to his son's death reveals the complementary aspect of their partnership, where Frigg acts from love against knowledge, Odin acts from knowledge against love, pursuing the information and alliances that will give the gods their only chance of meaningful resistance during Ragnarok. His sacrifice of himself on the World Tree, his bargains with giants and monsters, his gathering of the slain warriors, all represent the masculine counterpart to Frigg's feminine attempt to protect through binding oaths. Together, they model a form of love that transcends the personal and becomes cosmic. The willingness of two beings to share impossible burdens because sharing then makes both partners more capable of their individual destinies. Odin's wandering becomes bearable because he has a home to return to. Frigg's knowledge becomes endurable because she has a partner who can act on its implications without being destroyed by its weight. This pattern, established by the marriage of the highest gods, creates the template for all divine unions that follow. But each subsequent marriage explores a different aspect of how love functions when exercised by beings who exist primarily to maintain cosmic, rather than personal order. The marriage of Thor and Sif reveals love as the force that enables different natural processes to support each other rather than competing. Destructively, you see Sif not as the passive goddess of fertility described in simplified retellings, but as the active principle that transforms Thor's violence into life-giving force. Her golden hair is not merely a symbol of grain, but a representation of the Earth's ability to absorb and redirect energy, to take the destructive power of storms and convert it into the conditions necessary for growth. When Loki cuts her hair, he is not playing a prank, but performing an act of cosmic sabotage, temporarily severing the connection between destruction and creation that keeps the world habitable. Thor's rage at this violation transcends personal affront and becomes something like the fury of existence itself, discovering that its foundations have been tampered with. The replacement hair that Loki commissions from the dwarves represents more than restoration. It symbolises the introduction of craft and artifice into the natural world, the beginning of the process by which technology will gradually replace direct divine intervention in the maintenance of cosmic order. But the deeper lesson of this story lies in what it reveals about the nature of partnership between forces that are naturally complementary. Thor and Sif do not complete each other by filling in gaps or compensating for weaknesses. Instead, they amplify each other's essential natures, creating feedback loops that generate results neither could achieve alone. Thor's storms become more effective at promoting growth because they are guided by Sif's understanding of what the Earth needs. Sif's fertility becomes more resilient and abundant because it is protected and energized by Thor's strength. This type of love, based on the enhancement rather than the restraint of each partner's essential nature, provides a counterpoint to the Odin-Frigg model and suggests that there are multiple ways for divine beings to create stable, productive relationships. But it also reveals the vulnerability inherent in such partnerships when the connection between the partners is severed. Even temporarily, both become less effective at their individual functions. The marriage of Freyr and Gerd represents yet another model, one that explores the costs and benefits of love based on the attraction between fundamental opposites. Freyr's nature as a god of light and warmth should make him incompatible with Gerd, whose giant heritage connects her to the cold and darkness of the outer reaches of existence. Yet their attraction transcends simple compatibility, and operates instead on the deeper level where cosmic forces seek balance through union with their complements. Freyr's sacrifice of his sword to win Gerd's hand is not just a personal choice, but a transformation of his entire divine function. By giving up his primary weapon, he ceases to be primarily a god of war and becomes primarily a god of peace, trading the ability to destroy for the ability to create and nurture. This transformation is permanent and irreversible, representing the kind of fundamental change that love can work upon beings who allow it to reshape their essential natures. Gerd's corresponding transformation is equally profound, but operates in the opposite direction. Her marriage to Freyr requires her to leave the realm of the giants and take up residence among the gods, abandoning her connection to the chaotic forces of her birth in favour of participation in the ordered cosmos of Asgard. This is not simply a change of location, but a change of fundamental allegiance, a decision to support order rather than chaos, even when doing so goes against her basic nature. Their union creates something genuinely new in the cosmos, a relationship that bridges the gap between the gods and their traditional enemies, demonstrating that the boundaries between different types of beings are not absolute and can be transcended through sufficient commitment and mutual transformation. But it also establishes the pattern that will eventually contribute to the god's destruction, because Freyr's weaponless state during Ragnarok will prevent him from defending himself against the forces of chaos. This paradox, where love simultaneously strengthens and weakens the cosmic order, runs through all the divine marriages and suggests that the Norse understanding of love was far more sophisticated than simple romanticism. Love, in this system, is not primarily about happiness or fulfillment, but about the acceptance of responsibility for consequences that extend far beyond the individuals involved in any particular relationship. The failed marriage of Njordr and Skadi provides the darkest exploration of this theme, demonstrating what happens when the attempt to create harmony between opposites encounters differences that cannot be bridged through goodwill or mutual effort. Their union, arranged as part of a peace settlement rather than arising from natural attraction, represents love as a diplomatic tool, an attempt to create political stability through personal sacrifice. But the specific nature of their incompatibility reveals something profound about the limits of this approach. Njordr and Skadi are not simply different. They are adapted to environments that are mutually exclusive. Njordr's need for the constant sound and motion of the sea cannot be satisfied in Skadi's silent mountains, while her requirement for stillness and cold cannot be met in his warm, dynamic coastal realm. Their attempt at compromise, alternating between their two homes, satisfies neither and demonstrates that some differences are too fundamental to be resolved through practical arrangements. This is not a failure of love, but a recognition that love alone is not sufficient to overcome every obstacle, that compatibility at some basic level is necessary for any relationship to function over time. Yet even this failure serves a cosmic purpose, because it establishes the principle that not all attempted unions will succeed, that the gods themselves are not immune to the limitations that constrain mortal relationships. The divorce of Njordr and Skadi provides a model for the dissolution of relationships that cannot function, while maintaining respect and dignity for both parties demonstrating that ending a marriage can be as responsible an act as beginning one. The story of Thor's false wedding to Thrym operates on yet another level, revealing the violence that underlies even the most sacred social institutions when they are perverted from their proper functions. Thrym's demand for Freyja as the price of returning Mjolnir represents an attempt to use marriage as an act of conquest, to force the gods to acknowledge giant supremacy through the most intimate form of submission. The gods' response to this challenge reveals both their pragmatism and their understanding that some violations of sacred order can only be answered with violence. Thor's willingness to disguise himself as a bride, despite the humiliation involved, demonstrates the principle that maintaining cosmic order sometimes requires individuals to temporarily sacrifice their dignity for the greater good. But the true significance of this story lies in its revelation of the violent potential contained within all systems of social organization. The marriage ceremony, normally a ritual of creation and union, becomes a trap that allows Thor to position himself for maximum destructive impact. The wedding gifts and formal courtesies become weapons and distractions that enable the slaughter that concludes the episode. This transformation of wedding into battlefield serves as a warning about what happens when the sacred bonds that hold society together are treated as mere instruments of power and domination. Thrym's attempt to claim Freyja through coercion rather than consent violates the fundamental principles that make marriage meaningful, and the violent destruction that follows represents the cosmos defending itself against this violation. As you witness these interconnected stories of divine love, loss, sacrifice, and violence, you begin to understand that they are not separate tales but aspects of a single, vast exploration of what it means for conscious beings to create lasting bonds in a universe that offers no guarantees of permanence. Each marriage reveals a different facet of this central problem, a different approach to the challenge of finding meaning and stability within structures that are ultimately temporary. But the deeper pattern that emerges from these stories is not about marriage at all, but about the nature of choice itself when exercised by beings who possess the power to see consequences stretching across vast reaches of time. The gods know that Ragnarok is coming, that all their efforts to maintain order and create beauty will ultimately be consumed in universal destruction. Yet they choose to marry anyway, to create bonds and make commitments that they know will be broken. This is the ultimate expression of love as the Norse understood it, not the romantic fantasy of eternal happiness, but the existential commitment to act as if meaning were possible even in the face of guaranteed meaninglessness. The divine marriages are not about creating permanent happiness, but about creating temporary islands of order and beauty that justify themselves through their existence rather than their duration. And this understanding transforms everything about how you see the human marriages that surround you in this hall tonight. The young couple preparing for their wedding tomorrow are not simply joining their individual lives, but participating in the same cosmic pattern that governs the relationships of the gods themselves. Their vows will bind them not just to each other, but to the larger project of maintaining civilization against the forces of chaos that constantly threaten to overwhelm it. Their marriage, like the marriages of the gods, will require sacrifices and transformations that neither can fully anticipate. It will demand that they become larger than their individual selves, that they take responsibility for consequences extending beyond their personal desires, that they create something beautiful while knowing that beauty cannot last forever. But it will also connect them to the heroic tradition established by the gods themselves, the tradition of choosing love and commitment and creation in full knowledge of their ultimate futility. In making their vows, they will be declaring their participation in the eternal rebellion against meaninglessness, the ongoing effort to create significance through connection, even in a cosmos that tends toward dissolution. The fire in the center of the hall burns lower as the Skald's voice grows quiet, but the stories he has told continue to resonate in the silence that follows. Outside, the wolves that herald the end of the world grow closer, but inside this hall, there is warmth and light, and the knowledge that some things are worth preserving even when they cannot be preserved forever. The divine weddings you have witnessed tonight are still taking place, in every human couple that chooses to bind themselves together despite uncertainty about the future, in every community that maintains traditions of celebration and commitment despite knowing that all traditions are temporary, in every act of creation that defies the universal tendency toward entropy and decay. Sleep now, and dream of gods who loved so fiercely that they chose to die for it, of mortals who followed their example despite lacking their power and knowledge, and of the sacred bonds that connect all conscious beings in their shared rebellion against the darkness that waits at the end of every story. You can picture the wedding ceremony, held not in the green meadows of Midgard but in the golden halls of Asgard, where the very air shimmers with magic and possibility. But this is not a celebration of joy and new beginnings. This is a solemn ritual, a cosmic treaty signed not with ink but with vows that bind the speakers to their words until the end of time. Frigg approaches the altar wearing robes that seem to be woven from the aurora itself, shifting between green and gold and silver as she moves. Her face is serene, but there is something in her eyes that suggests she already knows how this story will end. Odin stands waiting, dressed not in wedding finery but in his travelling cloak, the one that marks him as wanderer, as seeker, as the god who can never rest. His ravens perch on his shoulders, and his single eye fixes on his bride with an intensity that would terrify a mortal woman. But Frigg is not mortal, and she meets his gaze with perfect composure, because she has already seen this moment countless times in visions, already knows what words they will speak and what promises they will make and what sorrows will follow. The vows they exchange are not about love or honour or cherishing each other until death do them part. They are about the distribution of cosmic authority, about the sharing of burdens too great for anyone being to carry alone. Odin grants Frigg the right to sit upon Hlidskjalf, the throne from which all the 9 worlds can be seen, making her the only being besides himself with the privilege of total awareness. In return, Frigg swears to hold her tongue about what she sees, to carry the weight of terrible knowledge without ever using it to prevent the tragedies she knows are coming. This exchange is the foundation of everything that follows, because it establishes the principle that will govern all divine marriages. They are not about personal fulfillment, but about cosmic function. The gods do not marry to be happy. They marry to maintain the delicate balance that keeps existence from sliding back into primordial chaos. And the price of that balance is often the sacrifice of individual desire for the greater necessity of universal order. You watch as the ceremony concludes with neither joy nor sorrow, but with the profound gravity of beings who have just taken upon themselves a responsibility that will define the rest of their existence. There is no celebration, no feast of congratulation. There is only the acknowledgement that something essential has been accomplished, that the framework of reality has been strengthened by one more carefully negotiated bond. But even as this first divine marriage establishes the pattern, you begin to understand that not all such unions will follow the same template. The cosmos is vast and contains multitudes, and the forces that must be bound together are not always as compatible as wisdom and power. Some marriages will require different kinds of sacrifice, different forms of negotiation between incompatible natures. The scene shifts, and you find yourself standing in a golden field where wheat grows taller than a man's head, and the grain seems to glow with its own inner light. This is the domain of Sif, goddess of the harvest, whose very presence makes the earth fruitful. Her hair is the same gold as the wheat around her, flowing down her back like liquid sunlight, and as she moves through the field, you can see the grain responding to her passage, growing fuller and richer with each step she takes. But there is something wrong with this pastoral scene, something that makes your skin prickle with unease. The air itself feels charged, as if a storm is building, and indeed you can see dark clouds gathering on the horizon, shot through with veins of lightning. This is the approach of Thor, god of thunder, whose very nature is bound up with the violent forces that both threaten and nourish the earth. When he appears, it is not with the gentle approach of a lover, but with the sudden violence of a summer storm. Lightning splits the sky and thunder shakes the ground, and for a moment you think you are witnessing not a courtship, but an attack. But then you see how Sif responds to his presence, not with fear, but with a deep, rooted calm that seems to draw power from the very earth beneath her feet. She does not flee from the storm, she welcomes it, because she understands what he does not yet realize, that the fury of the tempest is exactly what the growing grain requires. Their union is not a negotiation between equals, as was the marriage of Odin and Frigg, but a recognition of complementary forces that complete each other. Thor's lightning brings the rain that feeds Sif's crops. Sif's steady fertility grounds Thor's chaotic energy into something productive rather than merely destructive. Neither could exist in their full power without the other, and their marriage is the mythological explanation for why storms bring life rather than the only devastation. You witness their wedding ceremony taking place in a great hall built from living trees, where the walls themselves are part of the growing world, and the roof opens to the sky so that both earth and heaven can witness the vows. Thor arrives wearing his iron gloves and carrying Mjolnir, the hammer that can level mountains, but when he takes Sif's hand, his touch is gentle, restrained by the knowledge that his strength could destroy what he most values. Sif stands crowned with wheat and flowers, but her eyes flash with a power that reminds you she's no mere symbol of fertility, but a force of nature in her own right. The words they speak are about cycles and seasons, about the eternal dance between destruction and creation that keeps the world alive. Thor promises to bring the storms that will water Sif's fields, but to moderate his violence so that it serves growth rather than annihilation. Sif promises to anchor his wandering spirit, to give him a home and a purpose beyond the endless battles that would otherwise consume him. Their vows are sealed not with rings, but with a shared drink from a horn carved from the root of Yggdrasil itself, binding them not just to each other, but to the great tree that connects all the worlds. But even this harmonious union carries within it the seeds of future discord, because in the world of Norse mythology, no bond is permanent and no harmony is guaranteed. The story that everyone remembers about Thor and Sif is not about their wedding day, but about the morning when she woke to find her golden hair, the symbol of her power and the source of her beauty, cut away while she slept. The culprit was Loki, the shapeshifter whose nature compels him to disrupt every stable arrangement. But the deeper meaning of the tale is about how easily the bonds that hold the world together can be severed by careless actions. You see the rage that consumes Thor when he discovers what has been done, a fury that shakes the foundations of Asgard and threatens to bring down the very sky. But this is not simply the anger of a husband whose wife has been insulted. This is the wrath of a cosmic force whose counterpart has been damaged, whose ability to function in harmony with nature has been disrupted. Without Sif's golden hair, the wheat will not grow, the harvest will fail, and both gods and mortals will face starvation. The cutting of her hair is an attack on the fundamental order of existence. The resolution of this crisis requires not just the restoration of what was lost, but its transformation into something new. The replacement hair that Loki commissions from the dwarfs is not natural but magical, spun from gold itself rather than grown from Sif's body. It represents the intervention of craft and artifice into the natural world, the beginning of the long process by which technology will gradually replace the direct gifts of the gods. The new hair is more beautiful than the old, but it is also fundamentally different, a product of skill rather than nature, and its creation marks a subtle but permanent change in the relationship between the divine and mortal worlds. As you contemplate this transformation, the scene around you shifts once again, and you find yourself in a very different landscape. Instead of the golden fields of Sif's domain, you stand in a place where light itself seems to have substance, where the very air glows with a radiance that makes colours more vivid and sounds more clear. This is the realm of Freya, god of sunshine and prosperity, whose nature is to illuminate and nurture all living things. But even in this place of perfect light there are shadows, and it is toward one of these shadows that your attention is drawn. In the distance, you can see a figure whose beauty is so striking that it seems to dim the surrounding radiance by comparison. This is Gerd, daughter of the frost giants, whose nature is as far removed from Freya's as winter is from summer. She stands surrounded by ice and stone, untouchable and seemingly untouchable, her beauty terrible in its perfection because it offers no warmth, no welcome, no promise of reciprocated affection. The story of how Freya first saw Gerd is one of violation and consequence, because it begins with his unauthorized use of Odin's high seat, the throne from which all the 9 worlds can be observed. Freya had no right to claim this privilege, no authority to spy upon distant realms, but his curiosity overcame his respect for proper boundaries. When he sat upon Hlidskialf and gazed out across the cosmos, he was looking for something to interest or amuse him. What he found instead was an obsession that would transform his very nature. You can see the moment of recognition, the instant when Freya's eyes fall upon Gerd and he understands that he has discovered something that will change everything. The light that is his essential nature flickers and dims as if a cloud has passed over the sun. And for the first time since his creation, he experiences want, the terrible hunger of incompleteness that drives mortals to desperate acts. Gerd represents everything. He is not cold where he is warm, distant where he is welcoming, connected to the chaotic forces of the giants rather than the ordered power of the gods. This attraction is not love as mortals understand it, based on compatibility or shared values or mutual affection. This is the cosmic pull between complementary opposites, the force that draws light toward darkness and heat toward cold in an eternal attempt to achieve balance. Freya does not want to possess Gerd in the way a mortal man might desire a woman. He needs to unite with her because his nature is incomplete without its opposite, because the light he represents has no meaning without darkness to define it. But achieving this union requires a sacrifice that goes to the very heart of what it means to be a god of Freya's nature. To win Gerd's hand, he must give up his sword, the magical weapon that fights on its own and has never known defeat. This sword is not just a tool but a symbol of his power, his ability to protect himself and others through strength and skill. By surrendering it, he is choosing to become vulnerable, to transform himself from a warrior god into something else entirely. The wedding ceremony you witness takes place at the boundary between the realms, in a space that belongs neither to the gods nor to the giants, but to the liminal zone where transformation becomes possible. Freya arrives without his sword, carrying only gifts of peace golden apples that grant eternal youth, rings that multiply wealth, tokens of abundance and prosperity. Gerd comes surrounded by ice and shadow, her wedding dress woven from frost and starlight, beautiful and terrible and utterly otherworldly. Their vows are perhaps the strangest ever spoken, because they acknowledge from the beginning that this union will require both partners to become something they have never been before. Freya swears to moderate his radiance so that it does not overwhelm Gerd's cooler nature, while Gerd promises to allow warmth into her heart without losing the essential coldness that makes her who she is. They pledge themselves to a marriage that is also a metamorphosis, a transformation that will create something new from the interaction of opposing forces. But the price of this transformation extends beyond the personal to the cosmic level, because Freya's sacrifice of his sword will have consequences that reach all the way to Ragnarok, the end of the world. Without his weapon, he will be vulnerable in the final battle, unable to defend himself or others against the forces of destruction. His choice to prioritize love over warfare, fertility over combat, will ultimately contribute to the doom of the gods themselves. The marriage that seems to represent triumph and fulfillment also contains the seeds of ultimate tragedy. Yet even knowing this, you cannot condemn Freya's choice, because you understand that he is following the same pattern. Established by all divine marriages, the sacrifice of individual desire for cosmic necessity. His union with Gerd brings together the opposing forces of light and earth, creating the conditions for prosperity and growth that benefit all the 9 worlds. The sword he gives up is a tool of division and destruction, while the marriage he gains is a source of unity and creation. As you contemplate the complex implications of this wedding, your attention is drawn to a sound that seems out of place in this realm of light and shadow. It is the sound of waves breaking against rocks, the eternal rhythm of the sea that knows no master and acknowledges no boundaries. Following this sound, you find yourself transported to yet another landscape, one that represents a very different kind of divine marriage. Here, where the ocean meets the mountainside, you encounter the most unusual wedding party in all of Norse mythology. The bride is Skadi, daughter of the frost giant Thiazi, a figure of winter and storm whose natural habitat is the highest peaks where snow never melts and the wind never stops howling. She has come to Asgard not out of love, but out of duty, seeking compensation for her father's death at the hands of the gods, and she has been offered a husband as part of the settlement. But this is a marriage negotiation unlike any other, because Skadi has been granted the right to choose her own spouse from among the gods. With one crucial limitation, she must make her selection based solely on the appearance of their feet. This bizarre condition transforms what should be a moment of recognition and choice into a game of chance. A blind selection that reveals the fundamental absurdity of arranged marriages based on anything other than genuine compatibility. You watch as the gods line up behind a screen, their feet the only part of them visible to their potential bride. Skadi examines each pair carefully, looking for signs of nobility, beauty, strength, or grace, trying to divine the character of each suitor from this single visible feature. Her choice falls upon the most beautiful feet in the assembly, those of Njord, god of the sea, whose toes have been shaped by salt water and sea foam into something resembling carved marble. But beauty, as Skadi will soon discover, is not the same as compatibility. Njord represents everything that is opposite to her nature, where she thrives in the bitter cold of mountain heights. It requires the constant motion of waves and tides, where she finds peace in the silence of snow-covered peaks. He needs the endless conversation of the sea with itself, the crash of waves against rocks, the cries of seabirds wheeling overhead. Their wedding ceremony takes place at the boundary between their 2 realms, with one foot in the ocean and another on the mountainside. And from the beginning, it is clear that this union is more about diplomatic necessity than natural affinity. The vows they exchange are formal and restrained, more like the terms of a treaty than expressions of love or commitment. Each promises to respect the other's nature while maintaining their own, to attempt cohabitation while acknowledging their fundamental differences. The arrangement they agree upon is itself a compromise that satisfies no one. 9 nights in Njord's seaside hall, followed by 9 nights in Skadi's mountain fortress, an endless alternation between incompatible environments that ensures both partners will always be partially uncomfortable. This is marriage as diplomatic solution rather than personal fulfillment, a practical arrangement designed to prevent war between the gods and giants, while acknowledging that some differences are too fundamental to overcome through goodwill alone. You witnessed the failure of this arrangement through a series of small, telling details that accumulate over time like snowflakes building into an avalanche. In Njord's hall by the sea, Skadi cannot sleep for the sound of waves and the cries of gulls, cannot rest in air that is too warm and humid for her mountain-adapted nature. When they move to her fortress in the peaks, Njord shivers despite his divine constitution, finds himself constantly listening for sounds of the ocean that never come, slowly withering like a sea creature removed from its natural element. The end of their marriage comes not with dramatic arguments or bitter recriminations, but with the quiet acknowledgement that some incompatibilities cannot be overcome by effort or good intentions. They part with mutual respect, but also with relief, each returning to their natural domain with a deeper appreciation for what they had never needed to leave. Their divorce is as civilized and reasonable as their wedding, but it also represents a failure of the cosmic order, a crack in the foundation of divine harmony that will never be fully repaired. This failed marriage serves as a counterpoint to the successful unions you have already witnessed, a reminder that not all opposites can be reconciled and not all differences can be bridged. It suggests that the Norse understanding of marriage was sophisticated enough to acknowledge that sometimes the most loving thing two people can do is agree that they cannot live together, that individual happiness and cosmic necessity do not always align. But perhaps the most revealing divine marriage story is also the most scandalous, the tale that strips away all pretense of dignity and cosmic significance to reveal the raw mechanics of power, negotiation, and revenge that underlie even the most sacred bonds. This is the story of Thor's wedding dress, the most famous cross-dressing incident in all of mythology, and it begins with a theft that threatens the very foundation of divine authority. You awaken one morning in Asgard to discover that something fundamental has changed in the cosmic order. The sound that usually accompanies Thor's movements, the low rumble of distant thunder that marks his presence, has gone silent. Investigation reveals the cause. Mjolnir, the hammer that is the source of his power and the symbol of his authority, has vanished in the night. Without it, Thor is diminished, reduced from the defender of gods and mortals to merely another large, strong deity in a cosmos full of supernatural beings. The theft was accomplished by Thrym, king of the frost giants, whose motives are as straightforward as they are audacious. He wants a wife, specifically the most beautiful of the goddesses, Freya, and he is willing to trade the stolen hammer for her hand in marriage. This proposal represents more than simple bargaining. It is an attempt to overturn the fundamental order of things, to force the gods to acknowledge giant authority through the most intimate form of submission. The response to this crisis reveals the pragmatic core beneath all Norse attitudes toward marriage and sexuality. When Freya refuses to consider the marriage, as everyone expects she will, the gods must find another way to recover the hammer before Thor's weakness becomes apparent to other enemies. The solution they devise is as brilliant as it is humiliating. Thor himself will impersonate Freya, disguising himself as a bride to infiltrate the giant stronghold and recover his weapon. The process of transformation you witness is both comic and deeply unsettling, because it forces the most masculine of the gods to adopt the appearance and mannerisms of femininity. Thor, whose nature is defined by straightforward violence and uncomplicated strength, must learn to move and speak and behave like a woman, to suppress every instinct that defines his divine nature in service of a deception that goes against everything he represents. The wedding dress they create for him is a masterpiece of irony, flowing silks and delicate veils that barely contain his massive frame, jewellery that clinks and rattles with every movement, a bridal crown that sits uneasily on his weather-beaten head. Loki, serving as bridesmaid and accomplice, completes the picture with his own feminine disguise, and together they set out for the giant stronghold like the world's most unlikely bridal party. The wedding feast you witness is a study in barely controlled chaos, as Thor struggles to maintain his feminine disguise, while surrounded by enemies who would kill him instantly if they discovered his true identity. Every action becomes a potential betrayal, the way he eats too much and too quickly for a delicate bride. The way he drinks, draining entire horns of mead in single gulps. The way his eyes flash with barely controlled violence when the giants make crude jokes about their upcoming wedding night. Loki's role as bridesmaid becomes crucial to maintaining the deception, as he must constantly make excuses for Thor's unladylike behaviour. The bride hasn't eaten for 8 days out of anticipation for the wedding, he explains, which is why she devours an entire ox at dinner. She hasn't slept for 8 nights out of excitement, which accounts for the blazing intensity of her gaze. Each explanation requires additional layers of fiction, building an elaborate house of lies that threatens to collapse at any moment. The climax comes when Thrym, following traditional wedding customs, calls for the hammer to be brought forth and placed in the bride's lap as a blessing for fertility and prosperity. This is the moment Thor has been waiting for, the instant when his weapon returns to his control and he can abandon the pretense that has tormented him throughout the evening. The transformation back to his true nature is explosive, literally and figuratively, as he throws off the bridal veils and begins the slaughter that will end this mockery of a marriage. But the deeper meaning of this story lies not in its comedy or violence, but in what it reveals about the nature of marriage itself in Norse society. The entire deception is possible because marriage is understood to be a transaction rather than a relationship, a transfer of property and authority that can be accomplished without the genuine consent or participation of the bride herself. Thrym never expects to court Freya or win her affection. He simply assumes that possessing the right leverage will be sufficient to claim her as his prize. The god's willingness to use deception rather than direct confrontation also reveals something important about how they understand the relationship. Between power and legitimacy, they could, presumably, attempt to recover the hammer through warfare, but that would risk escalation into a conflict that might threaten the cosmic order itself. The marriage deception, for all its humiliating aspects, represents a more subtle form of diplomacy, a way of retrieving what was stolen without triggering the larger chaos that would result from open war between gods and giants. As you witness the aftermath of Thor's violent revelation, the giant hall littered with bodies and running with blood, you understand that this supposed wedding has actually been a funeral. The ending of lives and hopes that were built on false premises. The hammer is recovered, Thor's authority is restored, and the cosmic order is maintained, but the cost has been measured in the complete destruction of an entire household, and the final severing of any possibility of peaceful relations between the gods and this branch of giant kind. The story serves as a dark mirror to the genuine divine marriages you have already witnessed, showing what happens when the sacred bonds that hold the cosmos together are reduced to mere transactions of power and possession, where the marriages of Odin and Frigg, Thor and Sif, and Freya and Gerd represented genuine attempts to create harmony between opposing forces. Thor's fake wedding to Thrym reveals the violence that lurks beneath the surface of any relationship based solely on coercion and deceit. Yet even this tale of deception and slaughter contains within it the seeds of deeper wisdom about the nature of marriage and identity. Thor's willingness to temporarily abandon his masculine identity for the greater good demonstrates a flexibility and strength that goes beyond mere physical power. His ability to adopt feminine dress and mannerisms, however reluctantly and imperfectly, suggests that the boundaries between male and female roles are not as rigid as they might appear on the surface. More importantly, the story reveals that true power lies not in the ability to force others into unwanted bonds, but in the wisdom to understand what kinds of relationships can actually be sustained over time. Thrym's attempt to claim Freya through theft and coercion was doomed from the beginning, not because the gods were too strong to be blackmailed, but because genuine marriage requires the willing participation of both parties. A union based entirely on domination and submission cannot create the harmony and balance that divine marriages are meant to establish. As the echoes of violence fade and the giant hall falls silent, you find yourself transported back to the human world, to the mead hall where this entire evening of storytelling began. The fire has burned lower while you listened, and the shadows on the walls have grown deeper and more complex. But the Skald's voice continues, drawing connections between the divine stories you have heard and the human realities that surround you. For you begin to understand that every marriage celebrated in this hall, every union negotiated between the families of this community, follows patterns established by the gods themselves. The young bride, who sits nervously by the fire, preparing for her wedding tomorrow, is following in the footsteps of Frigg, accepting responsibilities that will extend far beyond her personal happiness. The groom who waits for her, negotiating bride price and dowry with her family, is reenacting the same careful diplomacy that brought Friar and Gerd together despite their incompatible natures. The elderly woman who supervises these negotiations, ensuring that both families receive fair treatment and that all proper customs are observed, is channeling the wisdom of the goddesses who understand that marriage is too important to be left to the passions and preferences of the young. The weapons that will be exchanged as wedding gifts, the swords that represent the merger of two lineages and the protection of future generations, are touched by the same significance that made Freya's sacrifice of his blade so momentous. Even the possibility of failure, of marriages that cannot survive the test of daily life, is acknowledged and accommodated within this system. The divorce of Njord and Skadi provides a model for separation that preserves dignity and maintains social bonds, even when individual relationships cannot be sustained. The community understands that sometimes the most responsible thing two people can do is admit their incompatibility before it destroys them both. The Skull's voice grows softer as the evening wears on, but his words carry even greater weight as he draws toward the conclusion of his tale. The divine marriages you have witnessed tonight are not simply stories about gods and giants, he reminds you. They are blueprints for human behaviour, maps of the territory that every couple must navigate as they attempt to build a life together in a world that offers no guarantees of happiness or success. The marriage of Odin and Frigg teaches that true partnership requires the sharing of burdens too great for any individual to bear alone, and the wisdom to know when silence is more valuable than speech. The union of Thor and Sif demonstrates that even the most compatible relationships require constant attention and care, that the bonds between partners can be severed by careless actions and must be consciously renewed and protected. Freyr and Gerd show that love sometimes requires the sacrifice of individual strength for the sake of creating something greater than either partner could achieve alone. Their willingness to transform themselves for each other's sake becomes a model for the kind of mutual adaptation that allows two very different people to build a shared life. The failed marriage of Njord and Skadi reminds everyone that goodwill and mutual respect are not always sufficient to overcome fundamental incompatibilities, and that sometimes the most loving act is the recognition that a relationship cannot work no matter how much both parties might wish it could. Even Thor's violent masquerade as a bride contains lessons about the lengths to which people will go to protect what they value most, and the ways in which gender roles and social expectations can be temporarily set aside when survival requires flexibility and adaptation. But perhaps the most important lesson contained in all these stories is the understanding that marriage is not primarily about individual fulfillment, but about social and cosmic function. The gods marry to maintain the balance that keeps the universe stable, and humans marry to create the alliances and continuities that allow communities to survive and prosper across generations. This does not mean that love and happiness are irrelevant or unimportant, but it does mean that they are not the primary considerations around which marriages are organised. Instead, love is something that can grow within marriages that are built on solid foundations of mutual respect, shared purpose, and compatible responsibilities. Happiness is something that emerges from the successful fulfillment of social roles rather than from the pursuit of personal satisfaction. As the fire burns lower and the hall grows quieter, you realise that the divine weddings you have witnessed tonight are still taking place in every generation and every community that understands marriage as a sacred responsibility rather than a personal indulgence. The young couple preparing for their wedding tomorrow will be reenacting these ancient patterns, binding themselves together not just as individuals, but as representatives of forces larger than themselves. Their union will create new alliances between families, establish new lines of inheritance and obligation, and contribute to the complex web of relationships that holds their community together. If they are wise, they will approach their marriage with the same seriousness that the gods brought to their cosmic unions, understanding that what they're creating together is more important than their individual desires or preferences. And if their marriage succeeds, as you hope it will be because they have learned the lessons embedded in these ancient stories that compatibility matters more than passion, that shared purpose creates stronger bonds than romantic attraction, that the willingness to sacrifice individual wants for collective needs is the foundation of all lasting relationships. The Skuld's voice finally falls silent as the last embers of the fire fade to ash, but the stories he has told continue to resonate in your mind as you prepare for sleep. Outside, the wind still howls like wolves and giants, but inside the hall, there is warmth and safety, and the knowledge that the bonds between people, like the bonds between gods, can create order and meaning even in a world that seems always on the verge of chaos. Tonight, you have learned that the Norse gods' greatest achievement was not their strength in battle or their wisdom in council, but their willingness to bind themselves to partners they might not have chosen freely, for the sake of a cosmos that needed their union more than they needed their independence. And tomorrow, when you witness the human wedding that will take place in this very hall, you will see the same sacred pattern playing out once again, as two young people agree to transform themselves into something greater than the sum of their individual parts. Sleep well, and dream of divine weddings and cosmic balance, of love that serves purposes larger than itself, and of the sacred bonds that hold both heaven and earth together against the darkness that always waits beyond the firelight.